He had 72 hours left, not because he was sick, not because he was dangerous, but because no one wanted him. Ash lay coiled in the back corner of the quarantine pen, barely more than a shadow pressed into concrete. His amber eyes glinted in the half-light, tracking every sound, every breath, every movement beyond the chain link. 3 days. That's all they'd given him. 3 days until they would end a life that had barely begun. When Evelyn Rowe arrived that morning, she didn't expect anything different. Another scheduled intake, another closed file. She'd been in wildlife rehab long enough to know the rhythm. But when the director at Bitterroot County Wildlife Facility led her to the last enclosure and muttered, "Nobody else would take him," she paused. Ash didn't hiss, he didn't snarl, he didn't plead, he just stared. And in that stare was something Evelyn hadn't felt in years, a pulse of resistance. Not the kind that screamed for help, the kind that had already stopped asking. He came in with a seizure from that roadside zoo in Idaho, the director explained. Barely 2 years old, born in captivity, never had a real enclosure, lived in a dog crate behind the feeding barn, no permits, no socialization, and now, no place to go. Evelyn didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the young Bobcat. His coat was mottled, patches of fur missing along his flanks. A faint tremor rippled through his hindquarters with each exhale. There was no visible wound, but she recognized the signs. He wasn't broken. He'd just given up. 3 facilities already passed on him, the director went on. 2 reactive, 2 risky. The courts gave us until Friday morning. We can't house long-term carnivores, not with our insurance. Evelyn's breath fogged against the frosted steel rail. She didn't need the paperwork to know the deadline. The weight of it settled over her shoulders like a mountain snowfall. She had space back at her own center, technically. An empty enclosure from a lynx release last spring still stood behind the shed. But space wasn't the issue. Ash wasn't releasable. He'd need care for life. That meant permits, vet support, funding, and time. The kind of slow, aching time it takes to earn the trust of something wild. The kind of time she wasn't sure she had left in her. "Just think about it," the director said, already turning away. He wasn't pressuring her. Not really. It was just the quiet resignation of someone used to letting go. She nodded once, then stayed behind, long after the others moved on. Long after the sun slipped behind the ridge and the floodlights buzzed to life. Ash didn't move. He didn't blink. But as Evelyn turned to leave, he let out a single sound, a low, gravelly chirp, barely audible over the hum of the lights. She stopped. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a question. And Evelyn knew, as sure as the snow would fall that night, that she couldn't walk away. Not again. 3 years ago, her husband's line had gone quiet on the wildfire radio. A tree fall in the northern range. They'd said it was quick. They'd said he wouldn't have felt it. But that night, the dog had waited by the door until morning. That's the part she remembered most. Some things don't know how to stop hoping. Back at her truck, she stared at the old flannel shirt hanging behind the seat, the one that still smelled like pine smoke and cedar oil. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. 72 hours, she whispered to herself. Then she turned off the ignition and went back inside. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. She lay awake on the worn leather couch in her cabin, coffee growing cold on the floor beside her, the fire in the stove flickering low. Outside, snow flurried against the windows, soft and steady, like the slow ticking of a clock she couldn't silence. Her phone sat untouched. She could have called half a dozen people, old colleagues, former interns, even the vet in Missoula who owed her more than a few favors. But deep down, She already knew how those calls would go. No room, no budget, no one willing to take on another high-risk carnivore who couldn't be released. She'd heard it all before, and she couldn't blame them. Ash was just another orphan of human failure, sold illegally, passed around like a novelty, then discarded when he grew teeth and claws. He had no experience with snow, with trees, with anything beyond steel walls and a rationed diet. His body hadn't learned how to fight. His spirit barely remembered how to want. And yet, that chirp, that sound in the dark, it echoed now in the quiet of her cabin, like a thread tugging at some part of her that she'd long buried. Across the room, nestled on the shelf between two old wildlife manuals, sat a black and white photo in a cracked wooden frame. A younger version of herself, arms slung around a man in a park ranger's jacket, both of them grinning beside a tranquilized mountain lion. Her fingers brushed the edge of the frame. They used to talk about opening a sanctuary together, a real one. Not just rehab and release, but long-term care. A place where the ones who couldn't go back to the wild still got to live out their lives with dignity. He died before they ever broke ground. The next morning, Evelyn walked the perimeter of the unused enclosure behind her cabin. The chain link still held. The lock worked. A fallen branch had snapped one corner of the privacy mesh, but that could be fixed. She made a list in her head. Fencing, permits, reinforced gates, new signage. She'd need to file new paperwork with Fish and Wildlife. Probably argue with the insurance guy again. It wasn't the cost that bothered her. It was the commitment. Ash wasn't a project. He wasn't a checklist. He was a lifetime. At noon, she stood outside the rehab center in town, the same flannel shirt draped over her shoulders. Snow clung to the hem as she leaned against the intake desk. "I'll take him," she said quietly. The director blinked. "Evelyn, are you sure? We can push the deadline a few more days if you need time to." "I'm sure." He exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath since yesterday. "All right. I'll get the paperwork started. Transport by Thursday?" "No," she said. "Tomorrow, before I change my mind." That night, she and Marcus, her part-time assistant, worked by headlamp in the freezing dark. They patched fencing, cleared brush, hauled platforms into place, and secured the reinforced gate. She set out fresh straw in the den box, layering it with the flannel shirt he used to wear on fall hikes. The one Ash would never know the meaning of. But maybe he'd feel the warmth in it anyway. At dawn, they loaded the empty crate into the back of her truck. Evelyn drove alone to Bitterroot County. No music, no heat. Just the rhythmic thump of tires on icy pavement and a silence that said more than any conversation could. Ash was sedated for the ride. When she knelt beside the crate, his breath came slow and shallow, pupils wide, paws tucked beneath his thin chest. He didn't resist. He'd already learned that resistance changed nothing. Evelyn whispered something only he could hear, then slid the crate door shut. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was low over the tree line, casting gold across the snow-dusted hills. They eased the crate into place beside the enclosure door. Marcus unlocked the gate. Evelyn opened the hatch. Ash didn't bolt. He stepped out like a ghost, quiet, deliberate, alert, but unhurried. He sniffed the air, turned once in a slow circle, then padded straight into the den box without a sound. Evelyn didn't follow. She sat on the log bench 20 feet away, arms folded, breath curling in the air, watching as the enclosure fell silent once more. She didn't know if this would work, but she'd already made her peace with uncertainty. Sometimes all you can do is show up. The first days passed like fog over the valley. Quiet, slow, uncertain. Ash didn't come out much. He moved like a whisper, only visible in the early mornings when Evelyn crept out with his food and sat just beyond the enclosure, thermos in hand, waiting. She never made a sound. She didn't call to him or rattle the fence. She simply sat, existing in his space, a presence without demand. He watched her, though. She felt it. The weight of his gaze, low and level, always from a place half concealed. Beneath the platform, inside the den, behind the scrub brush she'd arranged along the eastern fence line. He was learning her routine, the rhythm of her boots on gravel, the scrape of metal as the gate latched, the way she poured coffee, always slow, always with both hands, as if the world might shatter if she moved too fast. On the third day, he left half his food untouched. On the fourth, he finished all of it. That night, Evelyn jotted it down in her leather notebook. Full intake, no growl. Watched for 2 minutes before disappearing. She paused, then added, "Still no sound." She'd rehabilitated dozens of wild animals over the years. Owls with shattered wings, fox kits orphaned by traffic, elk calves dehydrated in summer droughts. But Ash was different. He wasn't injured. Not in the way people understood. There was no cast, no wound to stitch. His pain was deeper, older. It sat under his skin like frost trapped in bark, hard to see until the thaw. Evelyn didn't need him to trust her. Not yet. What she needed was for him to trust himself. To believe that the world beyond the chain link wasn't waiting to fail him again. She gave him silence. On day 6, the storm hit. Heavy winds came down the pass, tearing branches loose and lashing snow sideways through the trees. Evelyn had prepped the enclosure ahead of time, tied down the loose tarps, added fresh straw, reinforced the mesh. Still, she worried. That night, she sat by the wood stove, a radio crackling weather alerts in the background, eyes flicking to the window every few minutes. The wind howled like wolves. Tree limbs thudded against the roof. At some point near midnight, she pulled on her coat and boots. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just instinct. The snow came up to her calves by the time she reached the enclosure. Her flashlight beam caught the glint of 2 amber eyes near the back of the den box. Ash was awake. She didn't speak. She didn't open the gate. Instead, she stepped to the windbreak wall beside the enclosure and slid down, back to the wood, her body blocking the worst of the gusts. And she waited. 15 minutes passed. Then, slowly, Ash moved. Out of the den, into the snow, one careful step at a time. He didn't come close, just far enough to sit in the falling white, facing her. She saw it then. Not trust, not yet. Recognition. He blinked once, a slow, deliberate blink, the kind cats gave when they weren't afraid. Evelyn didn't move, just blinked back. The storm softened, as if even the wind had paused to watch. They stayed like that for a long while. 2 creatures built for solitude, sharing the same frozen night, neither one needing to explain why they'd shown up. Back inside, she stripped off her snow-soaked coat, hair dripping, fingers numb. But her chest felt warm. She didn't write in her notebook. Some things didn't need recording. They needed remembering. The next morning, she found paw prints in the snow. All around the enclosure, not pacing, not frantic, exploring. The turning point came over something small. It usually does. Evelyn had brought her lunch out to the bench beside Ash's enclosure, as she often did now. She didn't expect anything from him. She never did. She simply sat where he could see her, sharing space without intrusion. That afternoon, the sky was clear, rare for late February, and sunlight pooled along the snowbanks in long golden streaks. The pine trees were still, and the only sound was the soft crunch of her apple as she bit into it. Halfway through, the apple slipped from her fingers, bounced off her boot, and rolled gently toward the fence. She leaned forward to retrieve it, not thinking. Just movement. Natural, reflexive. Ash froze. He had been watching her from the raised platform, half shaded in pine needles. At her sudden movement, he tensed. Claws pressing into the wood, ears tight against his skull. For a heartbeat, she thought he might bolt, but he didn't. Instead, he stood up. Evelyn didn't move. She kept her body relaxed, her gaze lowered, breathing steady. The apple had stopped just inches from the fence line. Ash padded down from the platform, slow and cautious. His steps were deliberate, ears flicking with each sound, muscles taut but controlled. He stopped just short of the fence, lowered his head, sniffed the apple. Then, to Evelyn's astonishment, he batted it lightly with his paw. The red skin of the fruit gleamed as it rolled a few inches. He batted it again. Then again. And just like that, something changed. He was playing. The moment lasted maybe 30 seconds. But for Evelyn, it felt like the first day of spring after a long, merciless winter. She didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't move. She let him own it. Let him have that moment without interruption. When he tired of the apple, Ash retreated to the far side of the enclosure and curled beneath the log arch. His tail flicked once, slowly, content. That night, Evelyn opened the drawer where she kept old keepsakes, things she hadn't touched in years. At the bottom, folded carefully between two faded maps, lay the flannel shirt, her husband's favorite, worn and softened by 100 hikes and campfires. She held it to her face, inhaled the memory of pine, smoke, and cedar. The next morning, she tucked the shirt into the back corner of Ash's den box. He didn't approach it right away. But by evening, she noticed the straw had shifted. A corner of red flannel peeked through where there hadn't been one before. The next day, it was gone. Pulled deep into the shelter where he rested. He had chosen it. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Small steps, subtle shifts. One day, Ash met her eyes and didn't look away. Another, he stretched openly in the sun, belly exposed, no longer hiding in the shadows. The snow began to melt. Rivulets ran through the pine needles, and tiny shoots of green pushed up through the frost. Evelyn started incorporating enrichment. Nothing complex, just natural logs to climb, scents to explore, feathers tied to branches. Ash engaged cautiously at first, then with increasing curiosity. But it was the shirt that stayed with him, always in the den, always tucked beside him when he slept. It became something more than scent. It was comfort, anchor, proof that some things stayed. One evening, as the sky turned pink behind the trees, Evelyn sat on the bench with her notebook, observing. Ash stood at the edge of the fence, watching her. Then, unprompted, he let out a soft, rasping trill. It wasn't fear. It wasn't demand. It was greeting. She blinked slowly. So did he. For the first time, she spoke his name out loud. Hey, Ash. He didn't run. He stayed. By mid-March, the mountains were beginning to stir. The snow had receded from the south-facing slopes, leaving behind muddy trails and patches of wild onion poking through the thaw. The days were longer now, and with the sun came change, not just in the land, but in the rhythm between Evelyn and Ash. He greeted her each morning now, not with sound, but with presence. When she arrived at the enclosure with his food, he was there, waiting near the fence, eyes calm, tail flicking in recognition. He still didn't allow touch, and Evelyn never tried. But he no longer disappeared when Marcus came to clean. He no longer flinched at the sound of the gate. Progress, she'd learned, often looked like nothing at all. Until one day, everything was different. Evelyn began to introduce gentle training, enrichment with purpose. She used techniques she'd learned years ago from colleagues in larger wildlife facilities: target sticks, visual cues, reward-based conditioning. At first, Ash ignored the strange stick with the red tip. But the scent of quail, fresh, his favorite, was enough to spark interest. Slowly, over weeks, he began to associate the target with good things. Nose to stick, reward. Move to the platform, reward. Allow visual inspection through the fence, reward. He wasn't performing tricks. He was participating in his own care. And something about that gave Evelyn hope. One evening, after a long session where Ash willingly moved between 3 separate stations, Evelyn sat on the bench beside the enclosure and pulled out her notebook. She didn't write about his progress. Instead, she wrote about herself. "First time I felt useful in years," she scribbled. "Not just competent, not just busy, but like I matter." She closed the notebook and leaned back, watching as Ash settled beneath the log arch, the red flannel shirt still tucked beside him. Later that month, she got a call from a local university. A professor in the wildlife biology program had heard about Ash and wondered if her center might be willing to host a few senior students for observation. No touching, no interaction. Just study. Evelyn hesitated. Ash wasn't a display. He wasn't there for entertainment. But then she thought about what it might mean for them to see an animal like him who had come back from the edge, not because he was fixed, but because someone had waited long enough for him to heal. 3 weeks later, the students arrived. They sat in the grass outside the enclosure, notebooks in hand, respectful and quiet. Evelyn told Ash's story in soft tones: the seizure, the deadline, the slow thaw. Ash didn't hide. In fact, he came forward, drawn by the stillness of these new visitors. He paced the fence calmly, pausing near the students, his head tilted slightly. "Those spots behind his ears," Evelyn pointed out, "they're called ocelli. Cubs use them to follow their mothers through tall grass." One of the students, a young woman with dark braids and quiet eyes, stayed behind after the others left. "Why did you take him?" she asked. Evelyn watched Ash leap to the top of the platform, stretching out in the last rays of sunlight. "Because no one else did," she said. "Because someone had to." The girl nodded slowly. "He looks proud, like he knows this is his place." "He does know," Evelyn said softly. "And it is." That night, she walked the property alone. The air smelled of thawed earth and wet pine. Somewhere deep in the forest, an owl called once and fell silent. She remembered what her husband once told her, standing beside a smoke-scarred hillside after a wildfire. "You don't save a forest by stopping the fire," he'd said. "You save it by planting something after the ash." She looked back toward the enclosure, where Ash slept beside the flannel in the den box, his breath rising and falling in steady rhythm. He was planted, and he was growing. The call came in just after breakfast, as Evelyn was scraping frost from the cabin's porch steps. It was Martha Reyes from the Mountain Hollow Wildlife Center in northern Wyoming. Evelyn hadn't heard from her in nearly a year. They used to share caseloads when cross-state transfers were more common, back when funding wasn't such a constant uphill climb. Martha's voice was warm but cautious. "Ev, I've got something unusual." Evelyn leaned against the railing, phone pressed to her ear. "Ash?" she asked, her heart already pulling tight. No, not him," Martha said. "But related, maybe. We just received a young female bobcat, captive-born, like Ash. Failed reintroduction attempt. She's social, not with people, but with other cats. Doesn't show the same territorial signs most do." Evelyn didn't speak right away. "Her name's Juniper. She's healthy, curious. I thought of Ash when I saw her. I know he's been alone. I figured I'd float the idea." It hit like a punch wrapped in silk. Alone. Evelyn had stopped using that word, maybe even stopped believing it applied to Ash anymore. He had his den, his routine, his confidence. But she'd noticed the recent shifts. Pacing near the fence. Vocalizations at dusk. The way he sniffed the air longer than usual. Ears alert to sounds far beyond the enclosure walls. She had assumed it was spring stirring in his blood. Maybe it was something more. "I'll need her history," Evelyn said at last. "Behavioral notes, medical logs, everything." "Of course," Martha said. "But, Ev, no pressure. I know this isn't something you jump into." After they hung up, Evelyn stood in the chill mountain light, watching a raven wheel high above the tree line. She felt the questions settle over her like mist. Would introducing another soul into Ash's carefully rebuilt world save him? Or shatter what he'd found? She spent the next few days combing through Juniper's file. Born in a private facility, transferred twice, deemed non-releasable. But her notes showed promise. Responsive to other bobcats, low reactivity, food-motivated, curious. Still, the risk made her hands ache just thinking about it. She remembered what it took to get Ash to trust the shape of her sitting still. What if this changed everything? What if it pushed him back into silence? But what if the thing he needed wasn't solitude anymore? They prepared with care. Marcus reinforced the enclosure fencing. Evelyn split the space in half with temporary barriers, mesh-lined with scent pass-throughs, so Ash and Juniper could see and smell but not touch. Visual contact, auditory contact, but always with the choice to retreat. Juniper arrived 2 weeks later, wide-eyed and alert. She was smaller than Ash, sleeker, with a reddish hue to her coat and bright white tufts on her cheeks that gave her a permanently inquisitive look. Ash saw her immediately. The change in him was immediate and startling. He chirped, a sound Evelyn hadn't heard since the day he'd met her eyes in the snow. Then another, followed by a low purr-like trill. He paced along the dividing fence, tail high, pupils wide, moving with a restless energy that bordered on joy. Juniper responded in kind. She pressed her flank against the mesh. She mirrored his steps. They slept near each other, one on each side of the barrier. For 6 weeks, Evelyn documented everything. No aggression, no warning signs, shared vocalizations, parallel movement, even synchronized eating. And then came the question she had feared from the moment Martha called. Was it time to let the fence down? That night, Evelyn sat in front of the enclosure long after dark. The air was still, the sky heavy with stars. And from inside her coat, she pulled out her notebook. "It's not fear that holds me back," she wrote. "It's love. I love who he's become, and I'm terrified to lose him." But love, she knew, had always meant risk. And sometimes, the greatest act of care was letting someone step into something new. The next morning, she looked into Ash's amber eyes and whispered, "All right, wild heart. Let's see if you've got room for one more." They chose a morning when the world felt still. The sky was soft with low fog. Birds waited before singing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn, Marcus, and Dr. Patel, the local vet who had assisted with Ash's transfer months ago, stood in a quiet line at the edge of the enclosure. They had their safety boards, water hoses, and tranquilizer backup, though everyone silently prayed they'd never need them. Ash paced along the dividing fence, alert but calm. Juniper mirrored him on her side, her tail twitching with anticipation. They had shared 6 weeks of sight, sound, scent. Now came the moment where instinct would take over. Evelyn nodded once. Marcus unlatched the temporary gate. The center divider, tall and wrapped in mesh, swung open. And for a few heartbeats, nothing. Then Ash stepped forward. Not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate. He paused halfway, glanced back at Evelyn with those molten eyes, then turned and moved fully into Juniper's space. Juniper took 2 small steps toward him. Her body language was loose, ears forward, posture low. She chirped. Ash blinked. And in the space between them, 2 wild hearts suspended in decision. Something beautiful happened. They touched noses. Juniper gave a soft chuff and brushed her head against Ash's neck. It was subtle, reverent, a greeting of trust. Evelyn exhaled for the first time in minutes. Dr. Patel lowered his hand from the dart gun. Marcus let out a whispered, "Holy hell." Within an hour, Ash and Juniper were lying side by side in the sun. Not curled together yet, but close. Close enough that their shadows overlapped. The following days passed in quiet wonder. They explored the shared space with curiosity and playfulness. Juniper would leap to a platform, chirp, and Ash would follow. They groomed in tandem, shared meals without tension. He even allowed her into the den box, the one he had claimed for himself since day one. Evelyn moved more carefully now, not because of fear, but reverence. Something rare was blooming between the 2 animals, something born of patience and pain and the silent miracle of survival. Late one evening, as the sun dipped behind the tree line and mist curled low along the ground, Evelyn approached the enclosure with their final meal of the day. Ash and Juniper were resting near the back, flanks touching, tails gently curled in mirror shapes. Ash raised his head as she approached, eyes calm and steady. Juniper lifted hers too. She pressed her nose briefly to his cheek, then looked toward Evelyn. Neither ran, neither blinked. It was the first time Evelyn had ever felt invited. She knelt slowly, setting the food bowls down near the gate, and remained there for a while, just breathing, just existing. 2 pairs of eyes watched her, unafraid. And then Ash did something she would never forget. He stood, walked to the gate, and sat. Juniper followed. He looked up at Evelyn, and through the chain link, she saw it. Not the broken creature she'd found in the concrete pen, not the wary soul who paced in silence, but a sentinel, a protector, a creature who had chosen her too. She whispered his name, barely audible over the evening breeze. Ash. And he blinked, slowly, deliberately, the way he had once in the snow. Juniper mimicked him. Then both turned and walked back to the den, side by side. Later that night, Evelyn lit the old lantern outside her cabin, the one her husband had mounted years ago after they lost power for a week. It flickered once, then held steady, like the wild hearts sleeping together in the dark. Spring came slow to the mountains that year, the kind of spring that crept in rather than announced itself. One morning, Evelyn noticed the first wild iris blooming near the creek. The next, a pair of bluebirds returned to the eaves of her barn, where they'd nested before the fire years ago. But the clearest sign of change lived behind the chain-link fence. where two bobcats moved as one. Ash and Juniper had become inseparable. They shared everything now, their den box, their meals, their sun-soaked naps on the raised platform. They still had their differences. Ash was slower, more watchful. Juniper was bold, curious, unafraid to climb the tree trunks and peer out at the world beyond. But they met in the middle, always. One morning, Evelyn brought out fresh straw and enrichment logs. She didn't see them at first. Then, she heard a soft rustle. Inside the den, Ash and Juniper lay together, her head resting gently against his side, his paws stretched across her back. It wasn't just companionship, it was sanctuary. That same day, a call came in. Another facility had been shut down. This one a roadside petting zoo 2 states over. Dozens of animals. No permits, no long-term placements. The director sounded exhausted, familiar. "We're triaging the worst of it," he said. "But there's a pair of foxes and a cougar with nowhere to go. I know you're full, but I had to ask." Evelyn stared out at the mountains, her phone silent in her hand. The same ache rose in her chest, the one that always came when the world asked her for more than she thought she had left. She walked to the enclosure before she answered. Ash met her at the fence. Juniper joined a moment later, blinking in the golden light. They looked steady, whole. Not because they had been saved, but because they had been given time. Evelyn smiled softly. "I can take the foxes," she said into the phone. "I'll call about transport tomorrow." That night, she sat by the enclosure under a sky so clear you could see every thread of the Milky Way. Ash emerged from the den first, slow and deliberate, his movements now edged with quiet strength. Juniper followed, brushing past him, then circling back to press her side into his. They lay in the open, not far from where she sat, not hiding, not afraid. Evelyn stayed with them a long time, her coat pulled tight, the old notebook resting on her knees. She didn't write. She didn't need to. Some stories were finished not with a sentence, but with a silence that said everything. Eventually, Ash lifted his head, looked at her, then rested it gently against Juniper's. Evelyn whispered into the dark just once. "You made it." And in that moment, with the stars overhead and the earth warming beneath their paws, it felt true. Not just survival, but life. Real, full, chosen. When she rose to leave, they stayed. Curled together, safe. Home. And as she walked back to the cabin, the lantern by the door lit the path ahead. Steady, unwavering, and still burning strong.